Hello and welcome to the Hub. I'm Wang Guan in Beijing. A compromise deal is better than no deal at all, or is it? A group of US senators said they agreed on a bipartisan gun safety framework, which could become laws. This comes as the US Congress attempts to address back-to-back mass shootings in the United States. But does these minor tweaks to existing regulations be nearly enough to forestall and prevent future mass shootings? For more on this, we're joined by Douglass Sloan, principal at the National Capital Strategy Group and VP of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or NAACP, based in Washington, D.C. We also have with us today in Williamsburg, Virginia, by Robert Spitzer, Distinguished Service Professor at the Political Science Department of the State University of New York College at Cortland. He's also the author of The Politics of Gun Control. Welcome, gentlemen. It's great to have you with us. And we're talking about a very important issue that is a potential progress on a gun control legislation, which is considered by many as long overdue. Okay, first of all, Mr. Spitzer, let me go to you if I may. Let's talk about this potential gun legislation. A New York Times commentary said the deal is less than the Democrats wanted, but more than they expected, suggesting that this is somehow a compromise deal. It's better than nothing. Do you look at it that way?
It is a compromise deal. There's no doubt about it. The first and most important political fact about it is that it exists. That is to say, it was constructed by a team of 10 Democratic senators and 10 Republican senators. And the United States Senate in recent years has been the place that major legislation goes to die. And certainly 3 weeks ago, no one would have expected any possibility that they would produce any kind of new gun measure whatsoever. However, they have lined up 10 Republicans who have worked on this bill. And that number is important because it means that at a final vote on this, they should be able to marshal at least 60 votes out of 100. And even though that's more than a simple majority, the Senate still operates under an old filibuster rule that says that legislation can be stopped unless you can marshal 60 votes out of 100, not just 51 votes out of 100. So the fact that this exists by itself is significant. The Congress as a whole has not passed a major piece of gun legislation since 1994, and there was a less significant bill they passed in 1996, although notable. Since then, no, the Congress as a whole has not passed any notable significant new gun legislation, and there are some provisions of this bill that I think are very significant.
How notable do you think this potential legislation can be when you compare it against other legislations on gun control in the past decades? Because you studied on this issue and you even wrote a book about it.
Yes, and what's notable is that it tries to address a number of the important proposed reforms that have been discussed very much in the country in recent years. It doesn't quite fulfill them. So, for example, there's been much pressure on Congress to enact what's called a red flag law. And this is a law that would, about 20 states out of the 50 states in the US have red flag laws already. These are laws that say essentially that a relative or someone very close to another person who owns guns, who exhibits homicidal or suicidal behavior, can go to authorities and say, look, I think this person's going to do something bad with the guns that he owns, maybe she, but it's mostly he. And the guns can be temporarily taken away. They hold a hearing to determine whether the gun should stay away from the person or not. And these measures, there have already been several studies that indicate that they are fairly successful at preventing homicides and suicides in a small but notable number of cases. Now, this federal law doesn't require that as a federal standard. What it does is it is going to provide money to encourage states to adopt red flag laws. So it's trying to nudge states in that direction rather than passing a federal red flag law, which it could do. So, there's compromise in operation. How effective? Less effective than a uniform federal law, but more effective than doing nothing. And surely some states will sign on to that. So that's one example of, trying to find some kind of middle ground that would bring enough Republicans on board to try and get 60 people to sign off on this bill.
The devil is in the details. Mr. Sloan, I want to get your take on this issue. How significant can this potential bill be, really, to perhaps to curb future mass shootings in the United States?
Well, like Mr. Portman said, it can help. It can make a difference, given that it seems that the United States, essentially, for among other peer democracies, has very loose and liberal gun laws. Excuse me, it doesn't seem that way. It is. So it definitely is a step in the right direction. But many Democrats, like myself, feel that it's not a big enough step. It doesn't ban assault weapons. It doesn't ban the sale of semi-automatic weapons to people under 21, and it does not ban the sale of large capacity magazines, just to name a few. And this country's already had an assault weapons ban. That's not something that is out of the norm or is unimaginable. So and given that all of the mass shootings that have happened recently and the ones that have been really deadly have happened with AR-15s, assault rifles. So, this is a step in the right direction, but we just need something greater. We're in a dire situation here. I just watched a special on CGTN called America at Gunpoint, I believe.
Yeah,
and
it's done by my colleagues.
Exactly, and it's true. We are at a gunpoint. We are in an emergency situation here, and we need drastic measures. We need to take drastic measures to keep our residents and citizens safe.
So I want to follow up on that. Do you think these, changes, which are considered minor by some, are they enough to change anything? I mean, how far away are we from the perhaps next mass shooting, unfortunately?
Well, in this country, you never can tell. The former speaker just said the red flag law, or a variation of the red flag law, is in this gun bill, which will be very helpful. The reason why we're talking about it so much now is because the last two in particular, one that was racially motivated by a white supremacist, and the next one that was a horrific one that was done against elementary school children in Uvalde, Texas, which is particularly horrific, targeting little innocent children. Those two are American. Excuse me. Those two are particularly egregious to American citizens, race and children, and then the third one, I guess, would be women. But so in terms of why we are focused on it so much right now, it has to do with how these mass shootings took place, how violent they were. It was the worst mass shooting we've ever seen against in an elementary school. Was worse than Sandy Hook. And again, when you see a mass shooting that is particularly predicated on race, that cuts deep with this country that has had a history of racism and systemic discrimination within many of our institutions. So to come back and answer your question, it could very well be right around the corner. You can never tell in this country until we take stronger steps to aggressively get at this problem with guns. You never know when the next mass shooting is going to occur.
I mean, recent attacks in the United States were egregious, as you put it. I mean, I was at Colorado Aurora theater shooting as a correspondent there in 2012. I was at Sandy Hook in that same year, actually, sadly and tragically, reporting on the incident where dozens of school children and their teachers were killed. Those were really horrific events. Mr. Spitzer, let me go to you. I mean, what do you make of the fact that there's no plan currently whatsoever to ban semi-automatic weapons or other assault rifles?
Well, the House of Representatives, on their own accord, has moved ahead with several measures more aggressive than the United States Senate, but it's abundantly clear that those sorts of measures are dead on arrival, so to speak, in the United States Senate. And it's important to remember too that the backdrop of the failure of these sorts of actions, which are supported by large majorities of Americans and also by and large supported by gun owners, as polls have demonstrated, is the fact that aside from difficulty of dealing with the gun issue, we are in a point in American politics of deep partisanship, of hyperpartisanship, of fairly even political control at the national level between the two political parties involving the branches of government. As I mentioned earlier, the United States Senate, extremely difficult to get anything through the Senate. It's the place where big legislation has gone to die in recent years. And that, helps explain this dynamic. Mr. Sloan's quite correct that we had an assault weapons ban in place at the national level for 10 years, from 1994 to 2004. And recent studies have shown that mass shootings did decline during that period of time and then increased after the assault weapons ban expired in 2004, although the absolute number of mass shootings at that time was far fewer, and that number has increased over time.
Mr. Sloan, what do you make of the fact that there's no talk about universal background check? We're not only talking about teenagers or those under 21 or 18, but universal background check with gun buyers. I mean, what's wrong with that? That would sound legitimate to people in many other countries.
Well, assault weapons ban, ban on extended magazines, universal background checks, firearms training, extended licensing procedures, regular psych evaluations, all sound reasonable. They all make sense. But in this country, we're fighting ourselves within the political system that we've created. The Republicans, and it comes down to a political issue, the Republicans refuse to pass gun control, common sense gun control measures, even though the majority of American citizens want most of the things I just listed. They want all of the things. They want a universal background check. They want a ban on extended magazines. They want psych evaluations and firearms training and licenses. But the Republicans just refuse to pass it because they are in the pockets of the NRA, and the NRA doesn't want any gun control. So, all of this sounds reasonable. And to someone from the outside looking in, it doesn't make any sense that we have all of this gun violence, mass shootings at grocery stores, elementary schools, malls, concerts, you name it, we have it. And we still don't seem to be able to have the political will to pass common sense gun control measures. And it's a political issue because every single elected Democrat in Congress and at the state level will pass those laws, and Republicans will not. Americans have to sit down and have a look in the mirror about what their priorities are. If their priorities are saving themselves and protecting their children, then they need to vote Democrat, period, point blank. Coming back to your question, yes, we would want those measures. Yes, they do make sense, but it's a political issue here, and we're fighting ourselves.
Right. Mr. Spitzer, let's talk about the political future, the legislative future of this potential bill. These proposals currently discussed were supported by 10 Republicans, as you pointed out. If the deal is finalized, do you think the gun control legislation can get over 60 votes and pass the Senate? I mean, there were bad memories for the Democrats, right? If you talk about the Build Back Better world legislation, even one Democratic senator, namely Joe Manchin from West Virginia, could jeopardize or torpedo the whole plan.
That is true, although Joe Manchin, representing the state of West Virginia, and another Democratic senator who's gone her own way, named Kristen Sinema, are both part of the group of 10 Democrats who negotiated this. So the assumption is that they're in with this bill, or what will be a bill. And if in the actual writing of the bill, they can hold with the basic tenets as they've been laid out in the news, the House of Representatives will certainly pass it. and presented to the president for his signature. And I would just add one other point in relation to that. The Congress and members of Congress certainly taking pressure from the NRA, the National Rifle Association. It's the nation's oldest and largest gun group. It's reputed to be very, very powerful. Its actual power is less than its reputation. And there's a kind of a wrinkle to this, which is that the NRA is really in bad shape right now as an organization. And mostly it's their own fault. They've been hemorrhaging money, but through essentially corrupt leadership that has squandered money from their organization treasury. They've squandered it on sweetheart contract deals where they pay a whole lot of money and don't get much for it, where they've taken expensive trips to exotic locations, renting out private jets, and a host of things that kind of make you wonder, how they could have gotten away with this. And now the Attorney General of New York State is going after them in court because they may well be violating tax laws in the process. But even with all of the trouble, and they don't have the money that they had back in, say, 2016, but they've got two things going for them. That is the gun cause. One is you still have people all around the country who are loyal, gun rights people, gun owners who are loyal to the cause and still are, even though the NRA itself has, let's say, shot itself in the foot. And the other thing is that support for gun rights is more than just a banner now carried by the NRA. It's become a litmus test for conservatism in America. I mean, if you're a Republican and you want to prove you're a good conservative, one of the easiest ways you can do that is just saying, I'm against all gun laws and I support gun rights and the Second Amendment, even though the Second Amendment as law really has virtually nothing to do with these proposals that are now being discussed. So the banner really is being carried as much as anything by conservatives and conservative Republicans, as much as anything. And the gun rights people don't really need the NRA leading the way in the way they did in the past.
Mr. Sloan, do you have anything to add?
He did hit upon one point regarding the NRA and the Second Amendment. It's really interesting. The Second Amendment was ratified in 1791 when the strongest gun available was a flintlock musket that took 2 minutes to load. And they didn't even have bullets in. The bullets didn't come along until the 1830s. The first war in this country fought with bullets was the Civil War. So you really are looking at an outdated amendment to the Constitution. I can guarantee you the forefathers were not thinking about semi-automatic weapons and extended magazines and cop killer bullets and everything else that's legal in this country when they wrote that amendment. Article 1, Section 8, Clause 15 and 16 clearly outline the rationale behind said well-regulated militia and who would be able to call that forward and organize it. It would be Congress that would organize said well-regulated militia that's mentioned in the first stanza of the Second Amendment to defend the country in case of invasion. We didn't have an army, a navy,
not just any teenager, right?
Yeah,
people with mental health.
The greatest military on the planet. We don't need people to have guns to pick them up and defend this country anymore. We don't need that. So it really is an outdated amendment that, quite frankly, we need to get rid of because people are getting killed because of it.
Mr. Spitzer, are there talks or potential talks about changing the Second Amendment?
Well, not about deleting it from the Constitution. That idea has been discussed. But to follow up on Mr. Sloan's point, the full text of the Second Amendment, not to bore your viewers, but the full text of the Second Amendment is this: a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. And if you go back and look at what the writers of the amendment said it meant back in 1789 when it was discussed in the first Congress, it was all about protecting a right of citizens to have firearms in connection with service in a government organized and regulated militia. That was the understanding of that amendment for 200 years. And it only changed as a matter of law in 2008 when a newly emboldened conservative majority on the US Supreme Court, 5 of the 9 justices, decided that no, it really means something different. It really protects a personal right of a civilian, an average person, to own a gun for personal protection in the home. Now, that's not what our history says. That's not how the amendment was interpreted for 200 years. But of course, it was the banner of the gun rights movement that picked up steam in the conservative legal community and resulted in this change. But even with that modified or changed interpretation, even that court decision in 2008 by the Supreme Court pointed out essentially that most existing gun laws would really be fine under this new interpretation. And in fact, that's how lower courts have ruled since 2008. So the measures being discussed, including assault weapons bans, which exist in 7 states today, have been challenged in court and have been consistently upheld as constitutional under the Second Amendment. Even a measure of that sort does not, the courts have said in the past, does not run afoul of the Second Amendment. But of course, it's all about claiming legitimacy in the banner of the Constitution, and you blow your horn loud enough and hope that people don't read the fine print. And for the most part, they don't when it comes to Constitution.
A quick follow-up question, Professor Spitzer. Do you think it is more important to abide by the letter or by the spirit of a law? And in this case, in particular, the Second Amendment, we talk about gun possession for a well-regulated militia.
Yeah, well, I think both are relevant, but under either view, the only circumstance for citizens having guns is a government-regulated and organized militia, and we have not had a functioning universal citizen militia since before the Civil War in the middle of the 1800s. These days, if the government has a military necessity, it doesn't call up the militia, it enlarges the standing army. And they put you in the army and they give you the guns you need. Back in 1789, the country didn't have the means or the weapons to provide to militia members. And so they were obligated to get their own guns at their own expense. And that's why the wording of the Second Amendment is as it is. And when you hear it, and by the way, Article 1, Section 8, that nice quote, in addition, the militia is not only used to repel invaders, but to suppress domestic insurrections. That is to say, to put down rebellion within the country. So people who parade Americans who parade today and call themselves militias and threaten violence against the government are the very kind of people against whom the militias were designed to be used.
A very important clarification, sir, I would say. Thank you, and also Mr. Sloan, to spell out those nuances for our viewers, not only here in China, but around the world. Mr. Sloan, I want to ask you about political polarization in the United States right now. I mean, 10 Republican senators said they would be on board this time around for this potential legislation, but let's not forget, 4 of them are retiring and 6 of them are not seeking re-elections this November. So is America's political polarization really getting better, or is it still in a troubled state of affairs?
Oh, I would definitely say it's still in a troubled state of affairs, as you just so aptly pointed out. Yeah, the only one that is the only Republican senator that is up anytime soon, as I recall, is Mitt Romney, and he's in Utah. He's a Mormon. He's safe. As long as he follows the Mormon doctrine, he has nothing to worry about in Utah. And within the next 4 to 6 years, United States of America, with its never-ending news cycle, will be focused on something else. I can't imagine that there would be any political blowback for any of these senators that are still around seeking re-election. Like I pointed out, this is a political problem. This is an issue of Republicans and Democrats. All of the congressional Democrats, every single elected Democrat in the United States would support gun control. So that highlights the very partisan divide that we have in this country. And it again illustrates a very intriguing problem that Republicans, at least as far as gun control is concerned, do not represent the will of the American people. And it's mind-boggling that it really comes down to American citizens having to look themselves in the mirror because it's they need to ask themselves, is gun control an important issue? Is it a number one issue? And if it is, then you simply need to vote Democrat. Period, point blank. Republicans will not support gun control to the extent that we need them to. Kind of excluding the 10 Republicans that are voting for the current bill that is out right now, that is coming up short, as I pointed out in many places. It really is a partisan issue and highlights the partisan divide in this country, which is really intriguing. I'm a Democrat. I'm a Democratic strategist. I have been for all my life. I've been a Democrat, and I cannot explain why Republicans refuse to support gun control. Most of the mass shootings, most of them happen in red states, and it's crazy. It's mind-boggling. It makes no sense. But such is the state of the Republican Party.
Yeah, Mr. Spitzer, I want to ask you about one important factor of the United States as a society. I mean, the US, as far as I'm concerned, encourages debate and confrontation, which is good in a way, right? I studied in the United States. I mean, in an American classroom, debate is good for, getting informed opinions out to everybody, fostering creativity and critical thinking. But how did the US Congress come to a point where debate and discussion only reinforces stereotypes, dogma, and really expands the political polarization instead of reducing it?
Well, to some degree, it's a reflection of the polarization in society, although I think at least some of our political leaders bear significant responsibility for widening and deepening that polarization. In addition, the Congress as a governing body has changed in recent years. One of the complaints of our governing leaders in years gone by was that they were too clubby, too familiar with each other, too friendly, and that they didn't do an effective job representing their constituents sort of in decades gone by. And there was some truth to those complaints, but what's happened is kind of the reverse. It may seem like a small point, but it's not so small. In a pretty exclusive club like the 435 members of the House of Representatives or the 100 members of the Senate, they don't socialize with each other as they once did. They don't typically live in the Washington, D.C. area. Obviously, some do, but far fewer. And that has helped to kind of poison the well. In addition, some political leaders, I will say, especially from the right, Newt Gingrich is a name that has been mentioned many times in this connection, had kind of changed the tone of American politics by driving it with dark apocalyptic messaging, with going after opponents in ways that had not been seen in earlier eras in our politics, with kind of poisoning the well, so to speak. And the politics of personal destruction has been pointed out. And similar sort of tactics make it more difficult for people with different points of view to sit down in a room together, talk to each other, and hammer out something, resembling a compromise or legislation to advance the interests of the country. And we do have leaders here who see no particular value in agreeing to do anything that might boost the political fortunes of the other, the other side of the aisle, of the other political party. And Republicans don't want to do any favors for Joe Biden, and they certainly are worried that anything that comes out of Congress is something he'll get credit for, and maybe that would help him a little bit politically. And so there's an instinctive reaction to not go down that road, although this may be an exception to that.
This could be an exception. We'll see what concrete legislation comes out to the Senate floor this time around. That's all the time we have. Mr. Robert Spitzer, Distinguished Service Professor at the State University of New York College at Cortland, and Mr. Douglass Sloan, Principal at National Capital Strategy Group, also VP of NAACP in Washington, D.C. Thank you both so very much. We learned a lot. Thank you, sir.
Yes, sir. Good to be with you.
And that's all the time we have for this edition of The Hub. I'm Wang Guan in Beijing. Thank you for watching. I'll see you again next time.